Hello and welcome to my show on interpersonal communication. Today you're here with Dr. Marquita Byrd. I'm a professor emeritus at San Jose State University Communication Studies Department. I had the joy of spending 45 years teaching students across the nation about interpersonal communication and relationships. And I jokingly say that my class is the class you take before you end up having to go to the divorce court or to the psychiatrist or psychologist. Of course, we're not talking about therapy here, but we are talking about interpersonal relationships that are healthy, that function well, and to help us to have a good life. So I'm going to provide vocabulary today because very often in our relationships, we don't come to the most effective because we have no vocabulary to talk about what we're doing or to even understand what we're doing. So I'm going to talk about two sets of vocabulary in this lesson. The first one is dimensions of relationships, and the second set has to do with stages of relationships. Now, dimensions of relationships, we are made aware of those through our philosophers, through social psychologists, and they tell us that human beings can react to or become involved with people and environment through 4 dimensions. The first dimension is emotions, the second dimension is physical, the third dimension is cognitive, and the fourth dimension is spiritual. So we can actually interact in one or all of these dimensions of relationships. Let's talk about the first one, which is emotional. The emotional dimension is a dimension where you may do one of 3 things. Emotions have to do with feelings, how you feel about something. Affect, A-F-F-E-C-T. And if you're ever in doubt when you're writing, affect means feelings, effect means consequences. So that should help your writing there. Anyway, we can talk about emotions, and first of all, we can talk to people about how we feel. That's one of the dimensions that we can enter in with other people, talking about how we feel about anything, how we feel about life, how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about each other, but feelings. The second thing we do in the emotional dimension is to discover our feelings. Sometimes we don't even know what we're feeling, we don't know how we're feeling, and talking to other people about it can help us to clarify that situation. And the third thing is that we can stimulate emotions in each other. If you are a parent, or let's say you're a person who has younger brothers and sisters or older brothers and sisters, you understand that these people stimulate many emotions in you. For example, my children, when I became a parent, I discovered how deeply I could love, and that deepness continues even today with a son who's 46 and one who's 36. I discovered how much despair I could experience when I was concerned about having everything that I needed for my children. I discovered how much joy I could feel, how much contentment I could feel when I had children, because children stimulate those and many more emotions, and I'm sure I stimulate a lot of emotions with them. So we can either share our emotions through talk, we can discover our emotions through talk, we can stimulate emotions in each other. So that's the first dimension of interpersonal relationships, and that is emotional. The second dimension is physical. The physical dimension, of course, is there because we are physical beings. We are corporeal beings, and therefore we are in the physical presence of each other. Touching and distance that we use in relationships are ways that we interact with each other. Let's talk about touching. Touching has to do with pressure on the skin. Pressure on the skin. And we touch each other very often. Of course, in the pandemic, we have limited our touching a great deal, but before the pandemic, we touched very often. Non-sexual touching is touching that is intended to either direct the behavior of someone. Let's say, for example, you're walking on the sidewalk together, and you may touch someone's arm or put your hand behind their back. Or it can be a display of emotions other than sexual, non-sexual touching. So non-sexual touching, of course, has several manners in which it can happen. The first is we can actually physically touch a person. and family members do it. Not all families touch the same amount, but family members do touch each other. Friends, teachers and students, it goes on and on, but we do touch each other. A second thing is proximity. Proximity has to do with space and nearness in space. So we can interact with each other in the non-sexual touching through proximity. For example, very often when I would be in public with my father, who's passed away now, people would address us as Mr. and Mrs. And it's not that we were engaged in any physical touching per se, but we walked close together. We moved alike, because he was my father, so we moved alike. We kept a lot of eye contact, and that said, this is an intimate relationship, even without us being physically in contact. So proximity is very important, and you can be anywhere from on the skin to 6 feet away or more, and that has to do with your relationship. The last thing is doing physical things together. You say, what kinds of things? Well, it could be keeping the house. It could be taking care of children. When I go to the gym, I see couples, I see couples, but I also see buddies who come and they exercise together, and they are doing a physical thing together, so they're engaged in non-sexual touching. So that's one way that we can be involved physically. A second way is through sexual touching. Sexual touching is any touching that's intended to express sexual intent, interest, to initiate sex, excitement during the process, involvement, or ending the sexual contact. And my students often ask me, well, how can you tell the difference between sexual touching and non-sexual touching? Well, the difference is intent. The intent of the person who initiates the touch. If they are intending to just express emotions, to be close, that sort of things, like parents who pick up their children, friends who hold hands, then that's non-touching. But sexual touching is when the intent is to engage in sexual activity, or at least to stimulate interest. So those are two different things. And with non-sexual touching and sexual touching, you may be touching the same parts of the body, but not intending to go to sex, not intending to take it to sex. So it's not about the where you're touching the person. It is your intentions and how you're touching the person. So the physical dimension is one that's very, very significant, because we are corporeal beings. We cannot avoid the physical dimension. The third dimension is the cognitive dimension. And hopefully, as you listen to this lecture, you're engaged in cognitive behavior. Cognitive behavior has to do with thinking and problem solving. So hopefully in your life, you will have relationships that stimulate your thinking. Relationships that stimulate your thinking beyond talking about other people, but talking about ideas. The cognitive dimension involves thinking together, problem solving together, mental stimulation, and sharing ideas. And I tell my students, I hope that while you're in college, I think that while you're in college, you're going to have some of the greatest number of cognitive relationships, thinking relationships, because you have professors, you have your classmates, and you have groups of friends that you meet at college. Hopefully people have that on their jobs. Wow, the best jobs are the one where you have mental stimulation. If you don't have mental stimulation, you tend not to want to stay on that job. But the cognitive dimension is a dimension that we should have in our lives, and we should think with other people to solve problems, to stimulate our thinking. Reading books is a great way. Getting in a book club so that you are with people who are reading the same book can really influence your mental health. The last dimension is the spiritual dimension, which is a very difficult one to describe. But the spiritual dimension has to do with interactions with human beings, not a spiritual being like a God or an angel. But it has to do with talking to a real human being. And the spiritual dimension has to do with talking about things that are beyond the five senses, that transcend our daily lives. And we may be involved in this through sharing religious rituals or ceremonies with others. We may have conversations about religion, philosophy, the divine, the mystical, the transcendent, or other worldly matters, things that are not of this world. Let's say you're sitting around with your friends and you're talking about the nature of the universe and how did we get here and what are we doing here? What am I supposed to be about? That can fit into the spiritual dimension because it's not corporeal and it's not something that we can prove. These are things that we are involved with beyond the five senses. We can engage in spiritual dimensions, as I said, through being involved with any kind of religious organization or spiritual organization. And we can thirdly share an experience that takes us beyond ourselves and the five senses. It can't really be defined for each person. It's different for each person. For example, once I had a student who said that she had a spiritual dimension with her snorkeling partner, snorkeling in the water. And she said that when she went snorkeling with this person, or when she went snorkeling in general, she felt like she was in another world. She lost herself. She had a spiritual experience. And then, of course, doing that with a friend or a partner enhanced that. They would talk about that when the snorkeling was over. So then that they had a spiritual experience in the water. So I can't tell you where they happened or when they happened. You would have to define that for yourself. But the spiritual dimension is the fourth dimension. So we can say that human beings can engage with each other, interact with each other in one or all of four dimensions at the same time. The first one would be emotional. Of course, my student who was snorkeling felt very emotional about being in the water and seeing the fish and the coral in the water. It can be emotional. It can be physical. Of course, she was in the water. She was swimming. That was physical with her friend. Then it can be cognitive, which has to do with thinking together, solving problems together, stimulating thinking in each other. And lastly, the spiritual dimension, which is dealing with things that are beyond the five senses, which are beyond your daily life and worldly life. They may have to do with religion. They can have to do even with meditation. Maybe you have a meditation partner and you meditate together. That would be a spiritual experience. Spiritual experience has nothing to do with you talking to a supreme being. It's talking to other human beings about spiritual matters. So today, if you look through your relationships, you may find that you are engaging in these dimensions. And in intimate relationships, please remember that you will never have one person that you can have all of these dimensions with. That's why you have friends. You may have a spiritual relationship with one friend or associate. You may have a physical dimension with the people at the gym. I'm trying to get myself to go to the gym now, and I have a physical dimension with my trainer. So you very seldom get a relationship where you engage in all dimensions. That's why you have a community, but they are all important. So we talked about that first set of vocabulary, which has to do with dimensions of relationships. Let's go on to the second. So far in this lesson, we talked about one set of vocabulary terms that have to do with dimensions of relationships. And we're going to go on to the next section, which has to do with stages of relationships. Social scientists tell us that all relationships move through stages. And this is one of the most electrifying notions that we had about interpersonal in a long time. And it tells us that as we move through stages, our behavior changes, the way we communicate with each other, our expectations change. And if we're not on the same page as to where we are in a relationship, then we can have difficulties. So let's talk about what a relationship is. I've talked about it before, that a relationship is a pattern of interaction across time. Relationships have two things: content and feelings. We have content, which is the things that we work on, that we do together. The second thing is that we have emotions, we have feelings about the relationship itself. So the significance of understanding stages is that it helps us to talk about our relationships in an orderly fashion, number one, and we can talk about things like self-disclosure, emotions, listening, self-concept, trust, ethics, social penetration theory. We can talk about those things in terms of how they change across our relationship and through our stages. So this stages of relationships is very important. So we said the social scientists developed what's called a model of relational movement. A model of relational movement. And I do hope that you will go to the PowerPoints at the end of this lesson to see these things in action. The first stage is contact. Contact is yes, the first time you meet someone, but it also has certain characteristics that can take it into a stage in and of itself. Contact is the time when you first meet someone, you engage in phatic, P-H-A-T-I-C communication, which means small talk. You engage in small talk, you determine if you like the person, if the person is trustworthy, if the person is good or bad. There's a book called Contact, The First 4 Minutes, which was written, I don't even want to say how many years ago, but it was very influential in my thinking. And they talked about the fact that in the first 4 minutes of an interaction, you have decided, again, whether or not the person is trustworthy, whether or not they're likable, whether or not it's a person that you want to be do activities with. And lastly, even the possibility of sexual interaction within the first 4 minutes. So a lot goes on. That's why we tell you when you go to an employment interview, be prepared. Be prepared for that interview because the person is making quick decisions. When you are in the contact stage, you should be able to recognize the person and distinguish them from other people and decide whether or not you want to move on then at the end or to no longer interact. I have a great example. One semester I was teaching interpersonal communication, and I stayed in a duplex. Every morning 2 or 3 of the young ladies would come out of the duplex at the same time that I did to walk the campus. And one day I was in my interpersonal class of all things, and I looked in the class and I thought, oh my God, there's my next door neighbor. And we were at like midterm, and I didn't recognize her until that moment. I only recognized her when she was at the door. But once I was able to recognize her away from the door, away from the house, and in class, that's when we made contact. And so I shouted out to her, wow, I didn't realize you were in the class, I'm so sorry. Now we've made contact. So you can be in the presence of people, but until you recognize them as individuals from other people, you haven't made contact yet. Now, you will see when you look at the slides, because I actually have a diagram there, you can exit a relationship at any time, at any stage you can exit. Most relationships that we have in life, we actually exit at contact because, you know, we meet people at school, we meet people at work, we meet people on the bus, at the store, and we exit them at contact. The second thing that you'll find on the model is that we can move up and down between the stages. So now we're going to talk about going from contact to involvement. Now, so once you've decided that you might want to get to know this person better and you want to spend more time with them, you may become involved. Sometimes involvement occurs because you are in an organization where you have meetings, you have committees, that sort of thing, and so you have involvement. For example, I'm a minister, I'm at church a lot, I meet a lot of people, I'm involved with them because we are involved in church activities together. It could be your softball team, it could be your book club, or it could be other voluntary interaction. When you're involved, I renamed it the dating stage. And the dating stage has nothing to do with gender. Dating has to do with engaging in structured activities together. And so the dating stage is when you decide that you want to do things together, you spend time together, there are planned activities, there's exploration of common ground, you experiment with topics and behaviors to feel out the other person. You're liking, and you might have experienced this, when you become involved, you may like the person more, or you may discover something and like them less. So liking can improve, or it can decrease. You engage in self-disclosure, some self-disclosure. Trust, you may not trust someone immediately, but through your involvement with them, come to know them well enough that you do trust them. Your self-esteem may change during involvement. For example, if you have positive interactions with the other person, your self-esteem will probably get better. But if you have negative interactions, your self-esteem may take a hit because of something that is said or something that is done in the relationships. Again, you might exit at involvement. You may say, okay, I met this person, I've been involved with them with activities, we've done things, but now I'm going to exit the relationship. Let me point out that structured activities can be very fun, but women and men experience them differently. Most often men don't think about getting hurt in structured activities, but women do. So when you go out initially, women will say things like, let's go to the movie, let's go to the theater, you want to go somewhere and do something. And sometimes men will say, well, why don't you just come over to my house? And when the woman says no, then he's thinking, or he's saying, you don't trust me? And my answer is, no, I don't trust you because I don't know you yet. I got to come to know you. Coming over to somebody's house is a more intimate stage in a relationship, which is what I'm going to talk about next, which is intimacy. You may be involved, and then you may come to intimacy. Let me say that intimacy is not the same thing as sex. We use those terms interchangeably in our society, but you can have sex with someone you don't know. You can have sex with someone you don't like. But intimacy is something very different. I call that the marriage stage. When you have an intimate relationship, you're married to each other. I have 2 girlfriends that I met when I was younger than 15, and we're still friends today. We know everything about each other, with the good and the bad, and we still love each other anyway. That's what intimacy is about. So the people in an intimate relationship become a unit. There's high bonding. They see themselves as a unit, and other people will see them as a unit. For example, when I go home to my hometown, my classmates will say, well, where is Rosa? And I have to know everything that Rosa has done. I have to know what her husband is doing, how her children are doing, how her health is doing, because they expect me to know that kind of thing because they know we were married. One time I went home without Rosa, and one of my classmates said, where is Rosa? I thought you guys are married. And we still are married. It's been over 50 years now, and we're still fantastic friends. When you have intimacy, you're willing to sacrifice for the relationship. You're willing to sacrifice time, energy, maybe even money. There's high trust. When you're intimate with someone, you know them well enough to trust them. And what does trust mean? Trust means that you believe that this person will not intentionally hurt you. That's what trust is about in an intimate relationship. That person is highly reliable. You tend not to become intimate with people who you can't rely on. There's unconditional acceptance and love. As I said, I know where all your skeletons are, and I love you anyway, and I like you anyway. That's what intimacy is about. There is respect. You can't be intimate with someone that you don't have respect for. There's commitment. There's a high level of communication, and you can explain each other's behavior. For example, if someone said Rosa did XYZ, I probably could explain why Rosa did X, Y, and Z because I know Rosa that well. You can predict the behavior of that other person. Sometimes people leave or they exit relationships at the intimate stage for various reasons. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. But intimacy is not something that happens often. We don't have, usually most of us might have 3 or 4 intimate relationships outside of the family, but that's a high number. Normally it's 1 or 2 intimate relationships, but you do have them across your lifespan as you move about in the country, as you move jobs, you have different experiences. You may have new ones and other ones fall away. Let's go on to talk about deterioration of relationships. Oh, that dreaded experience. The relationship is going fine, and then it deteriorates. The bonds weaken. I call it the falling apart or loss of cohesion, deterioration. You have more conflict. You may have more conflict, less communication. less trust, less liking, less self-disclosure, less of a lot of things. There's intrapersonal, where within yourself you are aware that the relationship is deteriorating. And then let's talk about the reasons. There's many reasons why relationships change, and that could be a change in the context. For example, the people that I used to be involved with at my church, I'm not involved with them anymore, not because I don't love them or like them, but because we don't go to church together anymore. Goals may change. And lastly, you put distance in a relationship. How can you do that? I ask my students that all the time, who are with roommates that they decide they hate, and they can't stay in the room, and they can't move because it's not the end of the semester. And they put distance in the relationship by reducing talking, reducing shared activities, making sure that they're not in the presence of each other for very long periods of time. At deterioration, people often exit relationships. But here's the good news. When you find out a relationship is deteriorating, you have choices. Number one, you can choose to repair it. You can choose to renegotiate it. You can choose to leave it. If you choose to repair it, that means that you fix what is wrong. For example, you fix what is wrong. You say, we haven't talked with each other, we haven't made time for each other, let's do that. Or you may choose to renegotiate. My best friend Rosa and I, we grew up from 15 on, but then we went to college together. But then we graduated from college, we got married, we moved to the opposite coast in the country. And where we were used to talking to each other very frequently, as we got older, we couldn't do that anymore. She became married, I became married, we both had children, we both had careers. We were concerned because, hey, we're not talking as much as we used to. What's going on? We're not visiting. And so we renegotiated our relationship to incorporate the changes. We're more mature, we have more responsibilities. I still love her, she still loves me. So we decided we would have an appointed time that we would talk each month. And we would talk, we decided that we would send cards to each other for special occasions. We decided that when we were in the proximity of each other, like I was in California and she was in Missouri, then we would visit. So we renegotiated, which means that you change the rules of the relationship, whereas when you repair, you simply fix what is wrong. Lastly, you can choose to do nothing. If you find out a relationship is deteriorating, you may say, okay, I'm okay with that. I don't need to do anything about that. Especially, for example, if you're in an apartment and your relationship is deteriorated, but you know it's going to be over at the end of the semester, then you may say, okay, I don't want to do anything about it. We'll just let it deteriorate. So that's the loss of cohesion, when you become aware that you're not satisfied with the relationship. Lastly, we can talk about dissolution. Dissolution in a relationship, I call that the divorce stage. Dissolution is a stage that many relationships go through, and it's normal. It's something that happens, and we're going to have a whole lecture on that after this one. So please tune in to the next lesson. So we're going to talk about divorce, and it has to do with dissolving a relationship. We dissolve our relationships, unfortunately, sometimes with our parents. Sometimes we dissolve relationships with our children. We dissolve relationships with other family members. We dissolve relationships with people at our work, at our school, and all sorts of places. We dissolve those relationships. You're no longer a unit. You do not consider yourselves connected in any way. The bonds are broken, as in a real divorce. There's little or no communication. Here's how you evidence sometimes. Okay, so we're having a breakup and we're dissolved the relationship. So I give you the things back that you gave me. And you may do that with friends. Sometimes young people will break up friendship, and I'll give back my friendship rings, and I'll give back that basketball you gave me. Sometimes we give things back. At the end of relationships, we engage in grave dressing. Wow, you may be saying to yourself, what is that? You may be asking yourself that. Grave dressing is when the relationship is over and you tell all your friends what happened, and you're the hero in the end. Grave dressing. So you're breaking up, you've broken up in a relationship, and you tell everybody about it, and you tell from your perspective. Grave dressing is something that, again, is normal and that people engage in. So we can say that we can end relationships in two ways, either through gradual dying away or wasting away, or we can do it by sudden death. If it's by wasting away, you will see signs and patterns that change that indicate that this relationship is going to be over or it is over. Whereas with sudden death happens when somebody in the relationship says something or does something that makes the other person says, hey, I'm out of here. For example, with me, it would be being with someone who hit me, whether it be friend or intimate partner. If someone hits me, that's the end of the relationship. Now, for some other people, it may not be the end because they see that as normal or they're okay with it. Let's give you another example. Let's say you have a partner and you come home from work early and find out that they're in the bed with somebody else. That might mean sudden death physically, emotionally, and relationship-wise. On the other hand, a person could come home and find their partner in the bed with someone else and say, hey, that looks interesting, can I join you? So what ends one relationship does not necessarily end another relationship, but all relationships at some point end. When they do end, we grieve, we mourn the loss. We have a myriad of feelings. We may feel lost, we may feel overwhelmed, we may feel fear is very often there. We may feel, on the other hand, joy, happiness, freedom. And so you shouldn't feel sad if you feel freedom when a relationship ends. But relationships do end. So those are the stages of relationships. We start out with contact. Then we go to involvement, next to intimacy, and then to deterioration, and then dissolution. Some people don't go through all of those. You can exit at any point in the relationship and not go through all of those stages. Or you may go through them very quickly. Let's say you're at the airport. Oh my gosh, as we're having experiences now where people are traveling, you get in the airport and you end up spending overnight in the airport terminal because you can't get your flight. You may strike up a relationship with someone, and by the time that you leave, you may have gone through involvement. Okay, let's go get some snacks together. You may go through intimacy. You may talk about things that are very intimate. Then the relationship may deteriorate as you get here. Oh, your flight is there, and lastly, you get up and you depart. So you could actually go through these stages in a short period of time. So there's no time frame on how you go through the stages. So today we talked about two sets of vocabulary words that can help us to talk about our relationships. The first set had to do with dimensions of relationships, and that is the ways in which we can interact with human beings, our friends, our family. And the second set had to do with stages. We want to remember as we talk about stages that you can move back and forth. Let's say you were at involvement at one stage and you dissolve the relationship, you can come back to that, but you can never come back to the same relationship. Even if you can dissolve it and start a new relationship with that same person, but you can never be at the same place in the same time that you were previously. So relationships are complicated and complex, but you just learned two sets of vocabulary words that can help you to discuss them, to understand them, to maneuver through them in a way that's going to be healthy for you and the people involved. I hope that you'll see me on my next lesson. Don't forget to look at the PowerPoints at the end of this lesson. There'll be two, because we talked about dimensions and we talked about stages. And as I leave, I'll leave you with these words from my favorite person, Mr. Spock. Live long and prosper.